Today we're going to discuss the sun tracking, that is one-axis tracking. Here I'm showing you two tracking sets that are on top of a 10-foot by 10-foot pergola. Each of those panels is roughly 200 watts. Now I've used the Renogy MPPT charge controllers to charge my batteries. These are good because you can customize the settings a lot. They do have a weakness in that they are not very accurate with their voltage displays, but that is something you can easily overcome. Then these are charging lithium ion batteries. These are custom made out of some Nissan Leaf battery cells that are recycled. The batteries then feed these Victron Energy DC to DC converters, which then feed the inverters. The inverters are Renogy. I have a variety of different inverters and multiple independent batteries and MPPT chargers just for multiple redundancy. And you'll need roughly 4 of those 18 amp Victron Energy bricks to run a refrigerator. And the reason for that is because although the refrigerator itself does not draw much power when it's running, even with its compressor on, there's an inrush current that lasts a few seconds that can take up to a kilowatt. So you will actually end up using, you will actually slightly exceed the current ratings of those Victron bricks for a few seconds, but that's okay, they can easily handle it. These to those auxiliary panels so that a 100 watt untracked charges it. Okay, I'm now going to open this. This is the battery box. Inside there's a lead acid battery. There's a PWM controller, and I've used these connectors to feed through. And there's the controller. This is the solar controller, PWM controller. And now this is how my time lapse setup looks like on the roof. And this is now a sunny morning, and how the light comes down as the sun rises. You'll see that, of course, one panel is shading the other panel. They have a slightly different angle in the morning because the actuators have slightly different range of motion. And you can see here the sun is now picking up, and the shadow is disappearing off that left tracking panel. Again, it's going to be some time before the panels on the right start actuating, but the panels on the left will start actuating soon. This is now roughly about the same time of day, but it's actually a different day with a slight overcast in the clouds, but it's mostly clear. My batteries ran out on the previous day for the time lapse. So as you can see here, on a mostly clear day, the panel tracking is fairly smooth, and you'll notice that on an even clearer day, the tracking is smoother. And when there are clouds in the sky, the tracking becomes very rough. And now the other panel you can see here is also tracking. This is sometime around noon now. And you can see that was my coming over to look at the battery box, to take the battery box video that you saw previously. And this jiggling of the panels is partly from the control loop and partly from small wisps of cloud every once in a while, occluding the sun and changing the apparent brightest point in the sky. And this is now kind of, the sun is getting low on the horizon in the evening. Now it's this is the setup for the battery time lapse. This is the battery charge as a function during the day that corresponded to the panel time lapse that you saw previously. Now what you'll see is the current is not particularly high because the batteries are already fairly charged at 16.2 volts on this particular run. So the rate of charge is not going more than 20 or 30 amps. And every once in a while you'll see like a 10 amp drop in the charge current. And that's actually because the refrigerators, compressors are kicking on, or I have some freezers and refrigerators running off these. And now as the battery is getting heavily charged up to 16.7 volts, which is its max, there's only a small amount of current going into the batteries from the panels. It's only like an amp. Now, if the batteries were heavily discharged, you'd see more like 40 or 50 or 60 amps peak. This is now a cloudy day. On a cloudy day, panel tracking looks like this. And the reason for it is you have a diffuse source of light in the sky that's averaging out all the clouds when the sun is blocked. And there's point source illumination coming from when the sun is unblocked, and that's when the panels point directly at the sun. And now this is kind of at the end of the day when the panels are kind of going over there. And now you're seeing, this is the charge burst. Now the battery was more discharged, so you'll see the charge currents go much higher during the peak charges. But you'll see that they cut down to very low numbers every once in a while, and that's just a point when the clouds obscure the sun. So you have these spiky currents that are characterized by full current, maximum massive current when the sun is unblocked, to sharp drops down to the diffusive average, which might only be a few amps of charge. So it's for like 40 to 50 amps down to 2 amps of charge. And here's one last view of the panels from ground level. These are some additional panels here. Those are the tracking panels. And those are the two out there that recharge the PWM charged batteries that run the actuators. So let's just kind of deconstruct what we just saw with the time lapses and the cloud cover tracking. Well, first, is tracking worth it? Well, angle of sun comes in like this. There's a angle for the time of day and also an angle for offset from the season, and they both have like a sine theta type effect. And if you track, obviously you're orthogonal to the sun, and if you track with one axis, you still get the seasonal effect, but you cancel out the daily effect. If you don't track, you get this kind of an effect where you have about 5 hours of good time during the middle of the day, and then you have sharp drop-offs. It's flat-topped because rather than a sine theta effect, there's also a temperature loading effect. So now let's look at the case of, now let's consider the effect of few or no clouds. That is like very little cloud cover. Well, then you have this effect. Basically, there's this indirect sun from scatter from the few clouds that are out there, or the general glow of the sky, and then there's the direct sun. That's why you get this shape curve in your solar power. And see here some of the light. This is even before the sun comes above the horizon. You're getting some power on your solar panels, as you're seeing in this diagram here. And then once the sun has risen above the horizon, you start getting direct illumination from the sun. So you're kind of tracking along here. And during the middle of the day, you have this partial ambient glow from clouds and sky, and this direct illumination from the sun, as you can see from these angles and figures. And then something happens when around peak power, sometime around 2 p.m. or so, the panels are the hottest because the day is hot. And so you actually have a sort of a decrease in the power output because the panels are hot. Whereas in the morning, the panels were colder, and so you still got full power. Then at sundown, you get the same effect. You get some sky glow residual power, even if the panels are not tracking. So that's why you end up with this direct sun and indirect sun curves. The power that you measure out is just the overlay of these two, and you don't really notice the difference. You just see one single power curve. Now, what the heck does a chicken coop have to do with solar power? Well, you're going to find out. It turns out if you just have a timer like this that opens and closes the chicken coop, or a little light sensor like the one here that's used to control a chicken coop door, you can make a pretty darn good solar tracker. And the actuator that I was using happens to be the exact same actuator that I use on the solar panels. This is a light sensor here that just detects the ambient glow. If all you do is just have two positions that you flip your panels between, for example, flipping from a hard on to hard off with the actuator, and flipping the panels 45 degrees east to 45 degrees west or something, you get this kind of a curve. And whereas if you do full tracking, constant sun tracking, then you get this kind of a curve. But if you look carefully, it's not the total power, total energy collected, which is the area under the curve, is not that different. There's just a dip in the previous where you don't get it. Now, the previous curves were for winter solstice, so the curves were a little lower. And then for summer solstice, it looks more like this. You basically have a single larger, higher amplitude bulge, and if you were to just click between two different angles, you can get a curve that looks more like this, where you will have just a temporary minimum when you have your panel pointed incorrectly at noon, and your panel is harsh left or harsh right instead of towards the sun. Whereas if you do continuous tracking, carefully looking at the sun and monitoring the angle of the sun, or using a timer, then you get this kind of a curve. Again, the total energy collected, which is the area under this curve, is not that different. Now, if you do 2-axis tracking, then you can make it look like this all year long, because you're taking out the seasonal effect from having the sun lower or higher on the horizon. Again, this is not that different from summer solstice, but it is significantly different during winter solstice. So what are the conclusions that we have so far? Assuming you have no effect from cloud cover, you can probably double the total energy collected, although you still get the same peak power, out of a solar array if you can handle with the complexity of having a tracker. So that might be worth it, but you may want to consider some other features. Now, let's consider the case where you have lots of cloud cover, or a significant fraction of your sky is cloud covered. First, we have just some partial light cloud cover here. Whenever the cloud covers the sun, it basically kind of blocks down the sunlight. But you see the indirect sun is a little higher because you're constantly getting these clouds glowing. And if you have sun tracking going on, then you just get something more like this. Whereas the individual spikes when the sun happens to be blocked by the cloud look like this. But generally you just kind of stretch out the same fractional sun as your cloud cover. And if you have very heavy cloud cover, then again it looks like this. Again, the indirect sun is even higher now, and your points where the sun comes through show up as these sharp spikes of bright light. And you can see that the indirect sun also stretches further above and below sunrise. Here you might also use a timer too instead of a tracker. If you remember, the cloud cover tracking jiggled a lot and it was unstable because it was trying to track the brightest point in the sky, which alternated between the diffuse sky glow of the clouds and the sun. And that might wear down your actuator very quickly, because now you have thousands of actuations and swings during the day instead of just one complete actuation during the day, which will wear out your actuator quickly or fatigue your wires. So it's not obvious that you actually want to track when you have cloud cover. So the conclusions that we have from this for the moment is that you still get a benefit from tracking when you have cloud cover, whether you have very little cloud cover or very heavy cloud cover, but your diffuse glow does not respond to tracking. Only the sharp light from when the sun goes through the clouds responds to tracking, and you might also wear down your actuators quickly. Now, the last section we're going to consider is the actual solar panel footprint. If you track, you have to be careful about the actual range that you can get with your panels, because they will block each other. And if you looked at my panels, you'll notice that during the early morning, the panels shade each other, just even though they're adjacent and they're spaced out slightly. So you have to put a significant amount of spacing between your tracking panels in order to get the full power out. It turns out it's almost an exact wash. Tracking versus the amount of spacing that you need for large angles to prevent panels from shadowing each other kind of cancels out. So the only time it makes sense to track is if you do not have a lot of real estate to put flat panels down, or your panel costs are high and you have a kind of a finite spot like a pergola. Another consideration is that you probably can't put tracking on a residential building. It's probably not to code, but you could put it on a pergola. So again, for a off-grid or on-grid off-grid, which I define as your refrigerators or freezers in the garage are running off-grid batteries or something so that you are immune to power grid fluctuations. You can put a tracker on your pergola, but you can't prettily put a tracker on your roof.